Growing up in Canada in my elementary school, we learned about Louis Riel and his Métis rebellions. So, I'm using this opportunity to refresh my memory and revisit this part of Canadian history. Louis Riel was born in the Red River settlement, which had a primarily mixed native and European population. These people are more commonly known as Métis. Louis himself coming from Ojibwa and French-Canadian parents. At this point, the Red River Colony was part of the Hudson's Bay Company's territory of Rupert's Land in the modern-day province of Manitoba. Louis was a devout Christian and an able learner, but once his father passed away, he went somewhat haywire, traveling across Canada and some parts of the United States, working odd jobs here and there. This is until he decided to return home to the Red River Colony. This was purely a business venture, and the people already living in Rupert's Land were never taken into account. While Louis was gone, the Canadian Confederation had been discussing the purchase of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company, as it was feared that the United States might make the offer first. So, when the decision had almost been made, none of the citizens of Rupert's Land were aware that they would be soon under new jurisdiction and law, where Métis and Native people were seen as savages and lesser. It was a surprise to the people of the Red River Colony when men from the Canadian Confederation came to survey their land, which terrified mainly the Métis people of the colony, who held no documents to the land that they lived on, and would likely be forced from it in favor of white Anglophone Canadians. Being one of the few educated young men in this part of the land, Louis spearheaded a resistance and emerged as a leader, as, in a speech, he aided in the formation of the Métis National Committee and nurtured the anti-Canadian attitude among Métis in the Red River Colony. This group disrupted the surveyors' work and forced them to flee, which pulled the attention of the Council of Assiniboia, a government offshoot of the Hudson's Bay Company that still controlled the land, and Louis was summoned before them. Here, Louis made it very clear that no matter what was decided, the people would resist, unless there were negotiations with the Métis, rather than just the Hudson's Bay Company and Canadian government. Yet, the Canadian Minister of Public Works began amassing a small force to take the Red River Colony. But, by the sheer number of Louis and his allies, this army was forced to flee into the United States. Now, Louis Riel turned his sights on Fort Garry, which was important as it was the trading hub of the region and symbolized the center of power for the Red River Colony. Here, Louis and his men would remain and use the fort as a foothold to negotiate with the Canadians, who were very unwilling to do so, especially not with Métis. Here Louis and his men would remain and use the fort as a foothold to negotiate with the Canadians, who were very unwilling to do so, especially not with Métis. Louis would take control as leader of a de facto government and a primary negotiator with the Canadians. During these negotiations, Louis presented a list of 14 demands, including representation in government and recognition of Métis land claims. While this was all happening, a group of around 50 pro-Canadian armed settlers were discovered and arrested by the de facto Métis government. A leader of this group, Thomas Scott, kept physically harassing his guards and denouncing Louis. So, at his trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. This was a political move, in an attempt to show the Canadians that the Métis were no joke, and would go to extremes to achieve their goal. But this had an opposite effect, as the Canadian government, which was warming up to the idea of negotiation, retracted, with the image of the movement shifting to one seen as brutish. Still, a resolution was reached, and some demands of the Métis were met, while Canada extended its influence over the land. But, when the Canadian government sent a party to keep the peace in the former Red River Colony, many of the movement were afraid of being arrested or even lynched by the soldiers. So, many members of the movement fled to the United States, while others traveled further east into Saskatchewan, where the Canadian government had very little control. But, these Métis were soon followed by more English settlers traveling east. Many complex land claims and issues arose between the native people, the fleeing Métis, and the newly settling Europeans. To try and solve these issues, like-minded people grouped together to request aid from the government, who remained generally unresponsive to the demands for clarity and justice. The group of Métis settlers requested Louis Riel return to Canada from his flight to the United States to represent their movement. It didn't take much to persuade him to assist them. When he arrived, Louis Riel preached a moderate approach to these issues, and during this time, a petition was written and sent to the government by the Métis people. The government responded to this petition by sending a census to what was then known as the Northwest Territories. For some Métis, this was not enough, and seen as sweeping the issue under the rug to deal with later. So, a faction broke off from the more moderate Métis, who took up arms against Canada, and at the helm of this was none other than Louis Riel. These people feared the Northwestern Mounted Police stationed in Battleford, as it was feared that hundreds of reinforcements were on the way to subdue the insurgency. These people feared the Northwestern Mounted Police stationed in Battleford, as it was feared that hundreds of reinforcements were on the way to subdue the insurgency. Riel demanded that Fort Carleton, one of the first places that would receive reinforcements, be surrendered to the Métis, but the garrison refused. So, in the following days, the Métis entrenched themselves along roads from the fort. When men from the fort attempted to find supplies, they were stopped by Métis force, and soon after, a larger party was sent out to contest the Métis, and for much-needed supplies. Both forces were aware of each other, which led to the first bloodshed of the rebellion, where the superior numbers of the Métis forces overwhelmed the training of the Canadian forces. This caused the federal forces to understand their situation. So, not wanting the fort to fall into Métis hands, the forces razed the settlement and fled. In response to this loss, the government mobilized a sizable force and sent them down the Canadian Pacific Railway to deal with the Northwest Rebellion. All the while, skirmishes were frequent between opposing sides, and a group of Native Americans rose up and began attacking outposts. They were successful in their siege of Fort Battleford and their attack on Frog Lake. Now, the new federal forces arrived, and Louis decided to take his plan of attack in a different way, shifting from assaults to guerrilla warfare, knowing that the trained Canadian forces outmatched his Métis fighters. In a rare instance of Métis victory past this point, the rebels dug trenches and awaited the Canadians, where they routed the opposing forces due to surprise and a great defensive position providing ample cover. After this defeat, the Canadians were forced to rout and regroup. The entire movement was based around the town of Batoche, which was being enclosed upon quickly, and was the last holdout for the Métis fighters. During the siege of Batoche, the Métis ran out of ammunition, so many began firing rocks from their guns in a desperate attempt to subdue the attackers. Eventually, the town was overrun and Louis surrendered, while many of his comrades fled across the American border again. Riel was put on trial, refusing to plead innocence on grounds of insanity. He was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death, where he was promptly executed at the gallows in Regina, Saskatchewan.